And we are live. Can you hear me?
Oh, you sound brilliant.
Excellent.
Sound absolutely amazing.
All right. Let's see.
So does your clock. Your clock is just the metronome right on point.
Why don't you start this conversation and I will take care of my cuckoo clock.
Come on in, ladies and gents. Come on in.
All right. Hold on.
Thanks for joining us this evening. We're starting a new series here tonight. This is the All the Rage series. And in this series, Henry and I have been, we watch, we look, we follow along with what's going on in the general firearms space as much as anybody else. And it's probably been what, Henry, the last 6 to 12 months where the return of the SPR it's just been so on point under a couple different names. The Recce rifle name has been thrown around, but the return of the SPR has been strong. And so tonight we're going to talk through some of the basics in the background of this rifle, the rifle on screen, but also take a look at some of the history behind the Mark 12 and the SPR, and then look at where it is today in the modern landscape and why, at least hypothesize as to why it is coming back around. And then, of course, we do have a couple questions from our emotional support friends in Patreon that we're going to try to knock out here tonight as well.
Yeah, okay. So I think, you're ready to kind of like drop in and start talking about what this concept of all the rage is or could be.
Yeah, I gave him a basic background, but go ahead, let's hit it here.
All right, so all the rage. It's basically it's something that's fairly open on the topic, I suppose. We see things that pop up as trends, typically in the gun world. I think when a couple of years ago, it would have been the 10.5s, the Mark 18s, going as short as possible. And then at some point, it turned into the Recce rifle. I think, what was that, like 2018 timeframe?
Yeah, around the 2018 era. We started hearing the Recce rifle thrown out there.
And so the strangest, for me, is the strangest thing, because the SPRs have been, like, the concept itself has been around for a long time. But I think we're trying to kind of dissect it a little bit more and seeing why is the special purpose rifle nowadays, especially what we know as the Mark 12, why is this all the rage? And is it just the Mark 12 that's considered as the SPR nowadays? So essentially, all the rage, we're just talking about what's being portrayed as, so hot right now on the market, right?
So hot.
Oh, and somebody actually talked about a mini SPR. Interesting topic there, and it's like funny. Let me highlight this topic. I'm really bad with highlighting comments, but we've got a Marine here who was talking about a mini SPR, but Josh actually built a mini SPR.
Not quite even in that category. That 14.5 to 2 to 12. We're going to talk about that as well tonight. But the mini SPR that Henry's referencing is an actual, like, true shorty in the 12.5 variety. But
it's a shorty that I very much disagree with, because I think you should just go with a bullpup when you get to that point. But that's neither here nor there. We shall get to that point. Anyways, today I am going to become your slide jockey. So because Josh had prepared this slide deck, and then we're just going to go with a little bit of commentary here, and we'll just go on from there. Just let me know when you're ready to go next slide.
Yeah, let's rock and roll, my dude. I think we already covered it a little bit here, but the next key point here is some basic breakdown, and unfortunately, it appears you've uploaded the version without the borders on the text.
Borders?
No, the borders on the text. We're not going to be able to read the text. That's a shame.
Okay.
Can you give me present? I'll happily throw it up on my screen.
Okay, hold on. Let me see. I don't know how you can do that. Let me see if I could upload a different one. Anyways, can you start talking about it from this?
Sure, we can do that. So I think one of the key pieces here, Henry, and you can actually click over to the next one here, if you would be so kind. The key piece here is a question around the capabilities of the Mark 12 system and how, and Henry, to your point, when you and I discussed this leading into the conversation, how we routinely conflate the Mark 12 or the SPR specifically with a series of attributes or physical characteristics of the specific rifle, as opposed to the actual capabilities that the rifle was intended to fulfill. And so the first piece that we want to sort of draw back to on this is a conversation surrounding what those capabilities are. And overall, we look at an increased or improved accuracy potential, an increased or at least baseline element to PID or positively identify the targets being engaged, pressing out to extended distances beyond that of the standard sort of carbine at the time, capable of rapid follow-up shots as opposed to something more in line with, call it a sniper rifle system or a sniper system, ammo share capability with the standard infantry, suppressibility, and then ultimately, and this is a key piece, to maintain sort of the carbine capability of the setup alongside any of the other rifles being utilized. So in other words, to keep the rifle in some shape or form, maintaining its ability to be a fighting carbine, as opposed to like a full-on, again, sniper system. And so those are the capabilities I think that we've really nailed down.
Yeah. So in essence, what we're looking at here, right? You know, a lot of us, we look at what's an SPR. We ask that question out there. We ask people, what is a special purpose rifle? First thing you think about is a Mark 12. And then people start, you know, when you ask them, okay, so what makes a Mark 12 an SPR? People start rattling components that make the Mark 12 the way it is. Do you have a slide that you're talking about here that we're coming up on that?
Yes, indeed. It's the very next one, sir.
Okay. Yeah. So a lot of times, I think Josh and I have had conversation on this, you know, like when you're looking at rifles that were generated by the military, which the SPR program was a program with specific requirements that were based off of capabilities that SF wanted, that SOCOM wanted, right? Not SF. That would be, I think, actually, no, yeah, it was a SOCOM. It was a joint service venture. So you're looking at, hey, okay, so there's a capability gap that we need to fill. How do we fill it? Well, let's write some requirements and throw it out there and let the commercial entities build something for us to see what we can do. Specifically, that what's interesting on the Mark 12, when you ask people what an SPR is, they just describe you the Mark 12. Essentially, you're looking at a rifle with characteristics rather than the capability gap that it's trying to plug. So that's kind of like, okay, I need to move some furniture from my home to Josh's home. And so someone says, so we need a capability to move furniture, right? Because we have all these boxes and a sofa. So somebody then, so you need a capability to move. Let's say a moving purpose vehicle, an MPV. And so we come up with these requirements and someone says, okay, so we need a, you want to drop yours?
Let's see if it works.
Okay.
No, it's nope, same problem. All right, go on.
So let's get to so we need a moving purpose vehicle. And so when you get to a moving purpose vehicle, you start to define it. You go out and you buy something. It's a pickup truck, or it's a pickup truck. All right. So you take that and you're saying this is a moving purpose vehicle. It's an MPV, and so from then on, it gets defined that way, that it's a pickup truck. But you very well could use a moving van to do the same thing, if not better, because it blocks it from the rain. If you're moving a couch, but people, like, from then on, when you say we need a moving vehicle, they only think of a pickup truck and not a moving van or a boxcar or any of the other things that could do the same thing. That's where we're getting at right here. When people say we want an SPR, these are the things that they think about. They think about an 18 to 20 inch barrel. Technically, it's an 18-inch barrel for the SPR program, and that was partially a bureaucratic reason for them to get there. I forget why, but there was some reason that they wanted a 20, but then they had to knock it down to 18 to qualify for a different program. They were using match grade stainless button rifled barrels because those were the match grade barrels that were performing to that cost back in the day. Of course, a free floated handguard, and they were looking at magnified optics. Technically,
3.5
I don't know.
10,
I don't know if they
10.
defined that it was 2.5 to 10. It was just that the optics of the era were the 3.5 to 10x Leupold Mark IVs that were being dropped, or the 2 to 8 Leupold Mark IVs that were being used. And the Navy had some Night Force SPR optics as well, which were sort of that mid-range up to 10x, but the norm for a marksman's rifle back then was 10x. It was one magnification per 100 yards that you were trying to stretch out. So if you wanted 1,000 yards or 1,000 meter on your max range, you would choose a 10x optic. Match trigger, of course, that comes with the territory, and then using the Harris bipods that came standard with a Mark 12. The issued suppressor, now this was an interesting one because they did go through multiple suppressors and tested a lot of them, but the AEM5, the Allen Engineering, which back then was the OpSync Model 12 suppressor, was one of the more, durable suppressors, because they would drop them from 15 or 20 feet, and then it had to maintain zero. But then from what we saw, Josh, one of the added benefits, one of the strange things that it would also do, I don't know if it had something to do with the barrel harmonics, the AEM5 would actually shoot, like you would get like a 30% decrease in group size from what we saw when you use that suppressor.
That's right.
And then you also issued specialty Mark 262 77 grain ammunition. And all of this boils down to what we know nowadays as a historical Mark 12.
That's right. And so, Henry, just one last technical attempt here. See if you can share through the most recent one I've just sent.
This one?
There we go.
Nice.
Yes, now you can read it. All right, very good. So again, within context of this, right, like this then kits out to a very specific, exact firearm, right? Like that then becomes the Mark 12, Henry's Mark 12 here.
Perfection.
And to your point, Henry, like we've seen that suppressor, very unique, because I've not necessarily seen other suppressors do this, but that suppressor specifically materially tightened the group sizes on multiple variants of the Mark 12 that we have shot on the show, and reduced them by, like you said, not a small margin, like a relatively significant margin, 20-30%. So again, very interesting.
Well, and it's also one of the crazy things. If you guys out there have never heard of an AEM5 or an OpSync Model 12 being fired, it's one of the most quiet 5.56 suppressors that you'll hear.
Yeah,
I mean, it's got a lot of volume, of course. It's also a reflex suppressor that gives you a lot of volume without giving you a lot more of the length. It is heavy, however. It's one of the more heavy suppressors. but the sound itself and the tone is excellent.
Mm-hmm. So this is the rifle then, right? This is the early
Mhm.
2000s, mid 2000s rifle that is developed and rolled out based upon the requirements, again, based upon the requirements of capability that are listed. This is then what is spec'd out and what is delivered at that point in time. And it begs the question, and this is where, as we start to translate this conversation from the historical look on what the SPR was at this point in time into why was the Mark 12 in this particular configuration, this final configuration, the actual choice, and what drove that decision. And a lot of this comes from a look at what the technology of the era was. And Henry, you already alluded to it. The glass at the time, 3.5 to 10, right? 2.5 to 10, 3.5 to 10. That was what the optics available at the time were for that sort of mid-level range of optic, where you didn't have a true one power, and you also weren't trying to use a Hubble telescope, right?
Yeah, well, the shooting techniques that yielded that technology, right?
Hmm.
Because a lot of these guys making, coming up with the SPR would have been snipers, which doctrinally you're using mil dots to mill a target, range a target, you dial in, and then you take your shot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was doctrinally how you used it. Which the interesting thing is, I kind of feel that the Mark 12 started changing that doctrine between the Mark 12 and the M110, having that semi-auto capability. Going back to a lot of what Josh was putting down initially as, what kind of capability were we trying to gain? Well, essentially, you're trying to bridge the gap even between a designated marksman and the rifleman. You're trying to have something that could exist with the same ammunition, but stretch out just far enough. But at the same time, if, and this is a huge if, he needs to pull security with the rest of the squad, he absolutely could hang,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Absolutely.
So, when you're talking about the SPR, and originally it's not even a special purpose rifle, it was special purpose receiver. It was just something for SOCOM to where you would issue the receiver and you would clip that thing on whenever, as needed for a mission.
Mm-hmm. And so, to that point of hanging with the rest of the team, right, with the rest of the squad, what was the rest of the squad using at the point in time where the Mark 12 was put out? Right, like this
Look at
is
that
this is
scowl.
yes, this is the quintessential sort of setup of the era. In fact, this might even be like an enhanced version, right? You've got an ACOG, you've got a Knights Rail system on here, but effectively, this is the Block 1 platform, right?
Yeah,
So
you're
this
talking
is
about 0304 SF, early Iraq days. You've been in Afghanistan for a little bit, pivoting towards Iraq. Yeah, this is typically what your SF guys would be running.
right. So again, in contrast, right? Like when we look at the difference between that setup and this setup, it's a dramatic difference in those two configurations, right? Between
Hmm.
the original Mark 12 Mod O and where we get to with the Block 1 system. But as we see time progress from the early 2000s to the mid 2000s, the 2010 era, right? We see a material difference in what was being issued out and utilized. Again, not necessarily by regular army per se, but with at least within SOCOM, right? As we go into the Block 2 platform.
Hmm. So you've got more rail space to push some of your stuff out farther. That gives you more force multipliers. Technically, more of them used LCANs, so you're still looking at 4x. But
a 1 power capability against that 4x in many respects.
correct. And also, you had operators who would take the liberty of buying their own optics to supplement some of those capability gaps, even
Mm-hmm.
after the Block 2 program.
Mm-hmm. And the other key piece here that we haven't necessarily mentioned is the free float rail system,
Yep.
which is a rather dramatic adjustment because, again, when we look at the PRI handguard and the sort of the monolithic free float system that it had, it was very different from the other systems at the time, right? But as we see this next iteration, it's actually taking a step much closer towards where that Mark 12 system was. And then if we fast forward that again, sort of a final time into, we'll call it modern time, modern era, we end up with the URGI, which
Wait, where's the end goal? Anyways, we've got the URGI.
The URGI, Henry, which, again, when you look at what this ultimately has become, you have the free float system, quad rails removed, right? You're down to now M-lock is a thing and has been developed, but you're into a system where you basically have effectively like a form of a continuous top rail, not quite the same as the PRI, but ish. And you've got, again, a slick front end, much like on the PRI. And when you look at the technological advantages in the optic, the 1-8, the Night Force, the ATACR, I would go as far as to say that this is, in terms of the quality of the optic itself, the reticle that's included in this optic, this is in line, if not superior to, well, I don't want to even beat around the bush. It's just simply better than the 2.5 to 10 or the 3.5 to 10 that existed at the time. My opinion, having shot them side by side, right? Like, even though you have the better front objective, you theoretically have some advantages there. The 3.5 to 10 from the era is just not as good as the 3.5 to 10s or 2.5 to 10s or 4 to 16s that exist today, where you can see a distinct difference between an LPVO and sort of like that mid-range optic that has some higher magnification. The clarity of this type of an optic and whatnot. My point being, the technological advantages in the optics packages are dramatic. Again, going from 2010 era to where we are today. And so this progression is something that I find particularly interesting. And this is where I want to ask the next sort of round of questions, which is this here, the URGI. This is in many ways like very similar to what a modern civilian gettable.
All right. Let me do
is,
this because I'm the military
right?
one, and evidently, according to the internet, civilians don't get to say stuff like this. In my opinion, Army Ordnance guy, this is a militarized gamer gun. I mean, yes, you don't have the low mass bulk carrier, you don't have the adjustable gas. Those are things that are not great for military reliability. So why do I think this is a militarized gamer gun? I mean, it is a 16-inch barrel, 14.5 barrel with a, is it a MIDI?
MIDI, yep.
MIDI gas, very well gassed.
One of the bigger changes from this system to the URGI is the gas system adjustment, right, in terms of how it feels. And
dare I say, in the year of 2016, you already saw guys who were doing competition with setups similar to this. Mm-hmm. And the military took a few years to pull that into the fold and turn this into a thing for SOCOM, which is commonly jokingly referred to as the Block 3, right? It's not technically, it's a URGI. What was it stand for?
Upper
receiver group
in improved or something like that.
Yeah, improved. Yeah, upper receiver group improved. And so, in my opinion, essentially you took the M4 and you gamerized it, and then you militarized it. So from that aspect, you're looking at this too, right? So if you have two capabilities, you're looking at the rifleman with the M4, and then you're looking at the designated marksman with the M110, either the 110 or the CSAS. There is a giant gap in between, right? You've got one guy who's running heavy who can cover up to 800 to 1,000. One guy who has doctrinally you're covering to like 400 or 500. So there's this giant gap between 500 and 1,000 in between, where this guy isn't very good at CQB but can cover that longer distance. Like, how do you fill this gap in between? Now, what you have right here on the screen is the rifleman's rifle being enhanced so much that it can actually cover almost all the way to where this guy is. And back in the day when this gap was covered by the Mark 12, now you're seeing this rifle, the URGI, being able to cover this much of the Mark 12's territory that it basically lives in. And on top of that, it also has new stuff like M-Lock that's, creature comforts that could do more with more modern attachments and stuff like that. Is it a must from a military perspective? No. Is it a nice thing to have? Absolutely yes. So that's what you're looking at. The rifleman's rifle being enhanced so much that it covers more of the Mark 12's sphere. So now we're trying to look back at the trend of the age of the Mark 12. What is the age of the Mark 12 and how do we define the Mark 12 still? Is it the physical Mark 12 has to have an 18-inch barrel, has to, Douglas stainless barrel, has to have either the PRI or the Knight's handguard, has to use the OPSync suppressor, although I do think the OPSync suppressor has been one thing that hasn't been substituted, and has to use, and this is a big kicker, has to use the old school loopholed Mark IV 3.5 to 10x or the Night Force equivalent that has no ballistic reticle and is looking at a mil grid or mil dot and MOA scope adjustment. That's a big question. Like, right. Are we looking at this historical thing as forever the Mark 12, right?
Yeah. And so to that point, Henry, like just to nail the point home on what Henry's talked about that gap shrinking, which that's a great reference of what we're about to talk through. Like, think about, and it doesn't even have to be the URGI, right? Think about other ARs of mid to high tier quality that are available in the marketplace today, not just the URGI. You can think about Daniel Defenses, Knights, BCMs, anything within that realm, right? Those are rifles which pretty much all of those that we've tested, Henry, are capable of somewhere around 1.5 minutes of accuracy, give or take. The new modern technology on glass allows even things like LPVOs, which cap at a 6, an 8, or a 10 power, to be effective in being able to see targets at distance. And we'll come back to that point in a minute. And then when you start to get into extended distance engagements, it's like, within the purposes of at least, shooting at targets out on the flat range, we have 77 grain ammunition that we have readily available access to. And anything between a 14.5, a 16, and an 18-inch setup are all going to be moving that ammunition fast enough to be able to reach out to 600, 700, dare I say 800, maybe even a touch further than that, depending upon, the conditions that you're shooting within. Rapid follow-up shots, yeah. These are all things that as you go down, you can tick these boxes as you go, and that is precisely what we've done here. So when you look at all of these capabilities, effectively, what we would define, I suppose, as sort of just the general purpose rifle, right? Again, using that terminology for another, internet terminology that has been coined, the GPR. This general purpose rifle, which is basically like a 14.5-inch free floated AR that's got maybe something as simple as like a LaRue 2-stage trigger in it, which is like $75, very nice triggers, and has an LPVO on it, is going to be capable of doing a heck of a lot of the stuff that we used to ask the Mark 12 to do, to your point.
Now, I guess my question is, now, Josh, if you look at this is one of Josh's new babies. That's why he's putting it on the screen so much. It is a very nice rifle. Don't get me wrong. If we're looking at it from capabilities perspective and allow me to pose a question. What if I create the special poverty rifle?
Oh no.
that could have similar capabilities. Let's look at this. Let's do this mental exercise. And I'm throwing this at Josh because he hasn't prepared for this at all. A Palmetto State upper with an FN barrel mid-length, using don't change out the handguard because essentially it does similar things.
Mm-hmm.
An Anderson lower with the generic stock. Just make sure that you use a red Springco red spring and an H2 buffer on it, so it could work your bolt speed a little smoother. I would use a Primary Arms ACSS SLX 8x optic that costs, how much does that stuff cost?
$499 or something like that.
$499. There you go. And you have a ballistic adjusted reticle out to 600 or 800.
Yeah.
I
mean, honestly, like on what we do with these rifles, right? Like with what we're doing with them, is it going to feel like quite as smooth or be quite as clear or like feel as nice? No.
But the special poverty rifle probably would do the same thing.
It would probably do a lot of the same. Now, maybe the grouping would be a little bit wider. Like maybe you lose some margin of error, but it probably would do a lot of the things. Like, again, within the context of what we do with it, like probably, pretty much the same. Where you would potentially run into issues is just with longevity of parts, right? Like, are the parts going to be as consistent and constructed with appropriate tolerances that you're not going to run into issues after round 2,500?
It's just as good, Josh.
Oh, no.
Anyways, continue. I have done my job now.
So what I think that this leads us to is a question of like, what does that mean for the SPR? Because there's still absolutely questions about the modern SPR. But before we get there, and to the point of this exact sort of setup and where Henry's talking about bridging that gap, this is a snap of Jeff Gerwich from Modern Tactical Shooting, who is in Afghanistan in 2013 here, running the Block 2, again, back to Block 2 platform, and is running the Block 2 with a VCOG. And Henry, when we talked to Jeff about this, he was saying they were taking engagements to 600 plus and training with these guns, 14.5-inch guns with LPVOs out to 7, even 800.
They were there. So when Jeff was there, Jeff was one of the guys that implemented the Block 2 program for his team at the schoolhouse, actually at the SF schoolhouse out in Bragg. Which, by the way, if you guys don't follow, Jeff Gerwich, Modern Tactical Shooting, solid channel. Definitely highly recommend. He's got some solid, just real world experience that he offers to the firearms community. Guy's been, I think he was like an 18-year SF operator. So yeah, a lot of knowledge from this channel. But back to his rifle right here, the Block 2 FSP. You can see that he stripped the LCAN off of it and dropped a VCOG on it to essentially give the same capabilities that you're showing with your Night Force. But when he was teaching at the schoolhouse, they were pushing the SF operators to engage at 600 or 700 meter targets as a standard. And then they would push them past that as a confidence builder. And so I know, like, this is interesting to me because I was in country the same time in 2013, and everybody knew, because we all had just the regular M4s, or I had initially the M16A2 with iron sights. I specifically remember this being a conversation. Like, I actually had NCOs who were trying to trade for my A2 because they wanted that 20-inch barrel. They didn't care that it was iron sights. They were saying, man, I want more velocity in Afghanistan, because the word around the campfire is that the M4 couldn't effectively engage past 500. And you were looking at, a 400-meter rifle for effectiveness. But as you see right here, with a change of ammunition, a change of optics, I mean, SF was already pushing a 14.5-inch barrel way past 500, out to 600 and 700 meters, not yards. So that would be closer to 770 yards as a standard 14 barrel.
Yep.
And so in 2013, at the end years of the Mark 12, like SF already didn't use Mark 12s at this point. SEALs were sparingly using them. A lot of them had been passed down to the Marines, and we just didn't see them very often by this time frame, because of course we had also brought in the M110, which covered a lot of that capability gap too.
Right. So even as far back as, again, 2013, right, before the M-LOK or evolution, before any of that, right, we still have examples of pushing the 14.5 out to extended ranges to fill or close the gap on that particular requirement. Something really interesting here is this is the same time period, give or take, a little bit later, but like give or take, when I was first getting into competitive shooting by like a couple years, right? Like I think it was like 2010, 2011 where we started getting into it. And at the time, engaging out past, say, 300-400 yards seemed like a daunting task because we never did it, didn't practice it, didn't know what holds were, didn't know how to gauge wind or judge wind or anything of the sort. So at the time, to hear somebody say that they were pushing a 14.5 of all things, mind you, not an 18-inch gun, not a 20-inch gun, out to those distances, like I probably at that time would have thought, like, no way, there's like zero chance that that's happening. But now, like, with the experience of having shot a bunch of different stuff, granted, in many cases, modern kit, like, we've pushed these guns out to some of those distances. At the very least, like, I mean, again, we tease the idea of the mini SPR. Like, you were, I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but like, let's just say it hit, right? It hit out at distance. So
Josh's mini SPR project is a 12.5-inch barrel that he likes to shoot 77 grains out of. An absolutely absurd idea. And let's just say it was on one of the worst days that he had me shoot. Worst weather conditions, one of the worst weather conditions we'd seen, freaking cold and rainy, out to 800 on the DM designated marksman rifle course. So can it be done? Of course, yes, but there's that gets into more of the question of terminal velocity and actual use case practicality with wind drift and everything. So, but that's neither here nor there. We're looking at the question on how well can the general purpose rifle, your standard M4 type rifle, bridge the gap between with modern technology, with development of modern kit, bridge that gap that covers down the Mark 12s, that the Mark 12's playing ground that it used to cover back then. Because in talking to a lot of our friends, especially like Joe over at Bruiser Industries, I know you talked to Jim over at what's his name, Jimmy's Goon Life. Brass Facts and a lot of these guys talk about how can you stretch your general purpose rifle. But then now we're looking more at, how do you even define a special purpose rifle? Do you define it by the actual components used that turns into a Mark 12, or do you define it by the capability that it brings and being able to stretch and hit that 800? Because if you're looking at capabilities, like, we're there with better glass, with better ammunition, and with a little bit of know-how on how to use the kit. I've cleared 800 with some interesting things. And I know guys in service have also done the same and pushed it, like Jeff in 2013 with a Block 2. Blue Jean just came in, by the way, and he's calling us autistic, which we very much are.
Yeah. No qualms there. Yes, agree.
Anyways,
so there's a question then, right? Like, so all of this conversation has been identifying the base capability requirements and showing how over time, over the last 10 to 15 years, the gap on those capability requirements from what is sort of considered like the standard baseline capable 14, 16, 18-inch gun today, what many would consider a GP gun or GPR, is already kind of doing many of those things. So there becomes a question, which is like, where does that differentiate from the idea of the SPR compared to just a basic carbine outfitted with an LPVO? And that's a piece of the conversation. And then the other piece of the conversation, Henry, I think is the piece you wanted to cover off, which is a lot about the harkening back to the idea of components and cloning versus capability and performance.
Well, did you talk about the education piece already?
Good.
Well, I mean, that's so in it previously as Josh was putting the slides together, we both came to the conclusion, and I think, quite frankly, we're past that age, like when I was in the Army and people were thinking that the M4 can only reach 400 meters. I think we're way past that, because nowadays you've got more people pushing these things at a longer distance and realizing that a 14.5 or a 16 can cover all the way, even out to 800 if you really wanted to. Now, again, terminal velocity, there's a lot, there. Josh has an LSA rifle, the MPC, that despite it being a 16-inch barrel has a really expensive Bartline barrel in it that pushes projectiles faster than the normal barrel and actually comes out at this similar speed as an 18-inch Mark 12.
It beats it by over 100 feet per second. Yeah, it's insane. I have no idea. It's wizardry, right? Like Andrew up at LSA, right? Like the video that we did that on, that barrel pushes 28.15 with 77s.
So there's, I mean, there's like all these use case scenarios that nowadays we look back at it, and we're not beholden to the same misconceptions that we had back in the 2010s era. But that, unfortunately, I will say, unfortunately, there's still a lot of people who haven't fully embraced the fact that you can do that with current development in ballistics, barrel technology, and especially with new glass that has more precise and better ballistic reticles than the old glass used to have, and the capability of even dropping it down to 1x. And you have better micro red dot sights that even cover well past the under the low range of things and give you more like passive aiming, passive night vision capability, and stuff like that. And that education piece, unfortunately, some guys are just stuck in the 2010s, which is, I've got to say, the Mark 12, Mod 0, Mod 1, Mod H, all of those are actually really still really relevant rifles. And if I were to my Mark 12, I mean, let's loop back to the actual photo of my Mod 0 that you had on the slide. Are you able to click back to the very beginning? Like, if I wanted to take this, put a carbine stock on the very back, change the scope out to either like a 1:8 or a 2.5 to like a modern 2.5 to 10 with a good ballistic reticle, and drop a micro red dot sight on top, that's it. That would work essentially for 99% of what I need for modern use, and it would do the same. In fact, I think retaining the Allen Engineering suppressor would even do it in my opinion, I think that's a more appropriate suppressor than some of the QD suppressors like the Surefire SOCOM series. But to that point, we don't necessarily need, this system is very powerful as it is. It's really timeless as it is. But some of those old items have been surpassed by just, people in the civilian world experimenting and realizing that these things could go way past that. Kind of like USPSA shooters when you were out competing, being able to push way past, top level USPSA guys being able to push past what we were thinking would be the max capabilities of these things, and the military slowly adopting it to the URGI. Anyways, that's a long way of saying that education has come a long way, and we've realized that these things have much better capability to the point two, match the capability of what the Mark 12 was designed. So some of those components that you need, that if you were to clone something, that you would say you need these components in order to do what an SPR is set to do, to fulfill those requirements to those contracts, you really don't need those components because there's better components out there. But if you want a historical clone, and the Mark 12, our, let's say, quote unquote, historical clones would still very much be able to hang with some of the new rifles on that aspect when you're talking about performance versus a clone rifle.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of this comes back to this sort of this point that we're drawing to, which is that over time, the general purpose sort of standard carbine has closed the gap on what the Mark 12 was attempting to do. But what we're also now, what you just started to sort of get back into is, but what if you had something which was really actually more purpose-built as a precision 5.56 gas gun? What could that do? How does that compare against sort of the general purpose setup? Because in many ways, if we've closed the technological gaps and sort of the performance gaps through both proliferation of parts, through better education, sort of knowing what these things are capable of, through like the proliferation of match grade 77 grade ammunition, which is going to have a higher BC to defeat the wind better, as we do all of these things, we make them more available to more people, we get into this place where, yes, your GP gun can like do a lot of that stuff. But what about if you actually looked at a full on, still like relatively purpose built SPR in today's day and age? And I think that that's what is potentially driving a good amount of where this last point, which is this pop cultural influence that we're starting to see in this space, where you've got a bunch of the, whether you want to call them trainers, influencers, guys who have some sort of pop cultural influence one way or another, who are demonstrating the capabilities of taking a 14.5, a 16-inch, or an 18-inch gun, sort of any of them kind of work, right? The differences in the technological differences in things like the barrels nowadays, if you're getting a match grade barrel or a premium barrel, the differences between those two, 14.5 to 18, yeah, like that's not insignificant. But 16 to 18 or 16 to 17.5 or 16 to 14, like those singular jumps are pretty minimal. And so you have like this base setup, but then with the addition of something better than the low power variable optic, to your point, Henry, a modern sort of 4 to 16, like we've got on this one, right? That's the Attacker 4 to 16. You've got the 2.5 to 20s, the 3 to 18s, like everything that's sort of in that mid-range optic sort of bucket. Today, as compared to the LPVO, today is a vast improvement on your ability to see, to call impacts, to call splash, to call misses downrange. And when you focus in on maximizing those initial SPR capabilities that we talked about all the way back at the very beginning here of this list of capabilities, when you look at these, but you look at it purely through a modern lens, you get something which is basically like a 16-ish inch gun that has something like a 4 to 14 or a 2.5 to 20 or 3 to 18, whatever that is on there. And you're pushing 77s, and you basically have like what is in effect the same base rifle, not too different of a base rifle, assuming that your base rifle has a premium barrel in it. But with the optics package selection, you're able to really even further extend the range on the system. And the difference in extending the range on the system, and I think that this is probably worth us talking about a bit, is when you're shooting at, like a white spray painted target on a flat range, like that's one thing. And we can easily see those targets as we go out. We're not having to like fight to identify where they are or see them against the background. Really, like we're basically shooting on like a manicured range. But when you start having the additional capabilities of things like improved glass with a higher magnification, that's where you start to improve your ability to be able to collect those hits, because you can do it on your own, right? Like without needing a spotter to be there with you, who's looking downrange behind you to tell you where the rounds are going, which is part of why we do the Speedway series. But it also puts some emphasis on just how dang good so many of these base rifles are today. And so again, we've got guys like Bruiser, like Ridgeline, Jim's Goon Life, who sort of has his own entire show that's devoted to, in many cases, it's basically just his SPR journey and going to classes and shooting matches. Really cool episodes if you guys are into that stuff. Obviously, we have done stuff on the SPRs and shooting stuff at extended ranges for actually probably since the channel started. Even
that was one of the first videos I ever made. Was
the Mark 12 video, right? Yeah.
And back then, nobody had. I don't think there really was a Mark 12 video. Like it was just
not covering like the full history and breakdown and shooting at a distance and all of it like we did. No.
Yeah. Especially nobody covered the Mark 12 with the suppressor combination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so then you even look at some of the other like really big name YouTubers who are in the space right now, like Grantham and Admin doing their video where it's the SPR versus the Mark 12, and like how the shorty guns, which were very cool a couple years ago, are no longer like the cool guns because people are realizing that shorty guns kind of like suck for doing a lot of the stuff that you want to do with a full-on rifle if you have the range to shoot out at distance. They're very good in specific cases and scenarios, but like they don't excel at those, shooting at extended ranges. Obviously, Lucas made a big push to start shooting precision-based stuff this year. Big Tech's bringing in a bunch of the aforementioned instructors to their shooter symposium out at the ranch, where they do all of like the training and the classes associated with these scoped carbines or precision carbine-based classes.
And Brandon over at Texas Plinking, to be honest, like he and I text stuff every now and then, and I'd been psyoping him to do more like SPR stuff, and then he ended up like watching a bunch of SPR videos, and then like he got one, he loves it.
And then one that I know you already called out, Brass Facts and Hop do a good bit of stuff on this as well. One that is like brand new, it's DDN, Dim Desert Nights, I think it is. I don't know who the dude is. He's brand new to YouTube. He has like 2 videos. But his first video got 100,000 views in like a couple of weeks, and it was on an SPR. It was specifically about kitting out an SPR. It was a good video too. Enjoyed it. It was a very high grade gun, and for the first video, it was a really good first video for somebody joining YouTube. So again, like it's very interesting, and I wonder how much of the rise in current popularity is driven by a bunch of the social media guys like posting about precision carbine and shooting these guns out at long distances and the skill sets required to do them, and giving their expertise in them or sharing their journeys about developing the skill in it, versus how much of it is simply the fact that we basically have, like, you can basically go out and any AR you're going to get that's like mid-tier or up that has a nice barrel in it that can shoot an 1.5 inch, 5-shot, 9-shot group, 1.5 inches or so. Like it can basically press out with match 77s like to extended distances. Like I'm not sure where that line is and why we see it going one way or the other, like why it's becoming the popular conversation to talk about now here over like the last year or two.
I think if you're looking at the influencer side, so people who publish videos, us, well, not us because we've been doing like distance shooting for since we started, but there's been, and this is my theory, is that there's been such a saturation of shooting at dirt, like short range, blasting targets up close. Quite frankly, it is interesting to see how far you could shoot your rifles, right? And so the biggest thing that holds people back from getting to shoot at longer distances typically comes down to the range, the access to the range. I think Lucas over at T-Rex, he has up to 400-ish on their range. And then Garantha moved into their new facility, which they had infinite. And so he's been pushing more and more on longer distance stuff. You have Brassfax, he just goes out into the hills and he gets to shoot. But you have more, let's say, like this world of longer distance, like longer range shooting has just typically been not really. Well, we are obviously there, but it has been a very relatively uninhabited sphere for influencers to go into.
And I mean, look, like, let's not beat around the bush. We've talked about this a lot in some of our other videos. Like when we started to where we are now, like we've made large strides in both the production quality as well as in the capability of like how far we're shooting stuff. Like when we first started, we weren't shooting M4s out to 700, right? Or Block 2s out to 700 or 800. Right. Like it was, there's been a definitive progression in skill that we've gone through on the show as well. And learning, like to your point, the education component to this whole thing that you referenced earlier, like learning and like seeing physically that, oh yeah, no, like this is actually quite capable as soon as you figure out how to, like what the holds are and how to do it.
It's kind of like, so think of it like from a different perspective too. Let's look at, cameras versus cell phones. So back in 2013, yes, your cell phone, your iPhone can take video, it can take photos, but they were pretty crap compared to an actual like DSLR or an actual like Blackmagic or something that you would use for production. However, fast forward to 2023, you have guys entirely filming with cell phones nowadays. And while you could still tell, that doesn't mean that the quality is worse. That's not why you could tell. Sometimes it's like the stabilization automatically on a cell phone that you could tell that it was filmed with a cell phone, right? Like one of the new cell phones. And so similar to that, people are now learning that, hey, I could do a lot with my cell phone and not even use a computer or a Mac to edit the footage. You just use like an onboard like phone app to edit the footage and then just blast it off to social media in order to create the stuff. And so in a similar vein, your general purpose rifles has had all these different add-ons that has enhanced it, kind of like your phones, like at the core of the phone, it's been enhanced, but then you also have apps that enhance how your phone work. You have all these things that have enhanced it and pushed it so far, and your phone's getting so close to an actual camera's performance, your general purpose rifle getting so close to an actual Mark 12's performance. When you talk about the capabilities of an SPR, it doesn't necessarily mean the Mark 12 anymore. It could very well mean a 16-inch barrel rifle that has enhancements for it to reach out to what a Mark 12 could do. Now, I would still venture to say that the OpSync and the AEM suppressor, I would really, really like to see more development on that, because on the suppressor side, so you have flow-through cans that have been a huge breakthrough in the last few years. But on the other end of that, the opposite end of a flow through technology, you haven't had a lot of breakthrough in cans that could match the decibel or the tonal performance of the Mark 12's suppressor. And you don't really have suppressors like that that I've observed would actually tighten the groups that much. So that on that sphere, maybe that's something that people more so look at in the future. But that's my thought. And when you're talking about takeaways, what has enhanced things for us to get to where we are, and just like when we're looking at an SPR, and why there's an argument when people say, if it's not a Mark 12, it's not an SPR, and some people say, well, it could do the same thing, so it's an SPR.
Right.
It's that eternal struggle of the capability versus the clone rifle, or capability versus a historical rifle,
Mm-hmm. So with that said, I want to pivot and go to some of the Patreon questions, all of which we're going to try to keep like very centralized around the SPR system, questions associated with this episode. And some of this will be a little bit more practical in nature. It's like questions directly about things like ammunition, for example, ammunition selection. So first and foremost, if you're in the chat right now, there's almost 800 of you in here right now. Go ahead and hit that like button. Make sure that you guys are helping us out on the old algorithm. We certainly appreciate it. All right. So Henry, I'm going to ask you a couple of these questions straight away. All right. So,
okay.
And this is unfiltered. You haven't seen these. These are unprepped. Okay.
Gimme.
So the first one is hand loads for the SPR, or for your distance 5.56 gun, 5.56 gas gun or carbine. Are you running hand loads? Do you suggest hand loading for it? Or do you see any real advantages over doing that versus, say, shooting just like 77 Razor cores, like what we normally shoot, or the MagTech 77s or Black Hill 77s that we usually go through and shoot?
Okay, so one of the tenets of the SPR, and again, this goes back to when it was a special purpose receiver and not a special purpose rifle, was a flexibility in logistics. Essentially, back then they were issuing just the upper receiver halves for SF to clip on and use the ammunition that they had on hand. In my opinion, and this is in my use opinion, I would say, I would really recommend looking at these from that logistical perspective of cartridge commonality, using generally easy to find ammunition to accomplish that task. Could I use hand loads? Of course, the answer is yes. Would I use hand loads? Me personally, the answer is no, because 5.56 in 77 grain is still at a relatively good price as opposed to 7.6251, or I know some people here are talking about 6.8, and some of the specialty rounds, 6.5 Grendel and things like that.
Yeah, 6 arc is getting hot. That's all the hotness nowadays, right?
Yeah, I don't typically prefer those just because that's a logistical problem. From a military perspective, introducing a separate cartridge is a big pain when it comes to ammunition management and issuance. From a civilian perspective, that translates into a financial burden, but also from the financial side, it translates into you shooting less from that platform to have the real world experience to understand and have that education on what your firearm could do. So I don't do that because I like to consolidate my education towards things that I could just pick up. I mean, you've seen me do that. I just pick up a rifle, drop 77s in there, and I know the holds. I pick up a 308 rifle, drop 175s in there. As long as it's zeroed, I know it's hold going out to 800. That itself, that education piece is really big for me. So when I look at using what cartridge selection I would choose, I would always err on the side of logistic convenience over the incremental or potentially larger performance, but more difficulty finding parts and ammunition. That's me.
Yeah. And then I think that the only extension that I would add to that is, especially when you start to talk about the stipulation in the United States where you might ever actually need the rifle for more than shooting targets, like under those circumstances, those considerations around the logistics become like primo, right? Like that becomes like a major driving factor of the decision making. Okay, next one, and we covered this already, sort of at length, so it won't beat it to death. But what are your thoughts on SOCOM ditching Mark 12s and in effect basically running URGIs with LPVOs or URGIs with some sort of mid power optic, the Leupold Mark 5s, like the 3-16s or 3-18s rather, something like I've got the 4-16 attacker. Like, what are your thoughts on that? You think that that's the right choice? Taking the general purpose sort of base rifle and simply swapping the optics package and saying, okay, like this should be good enough to do what we're asking this setup to do?
If it is, then why not? I mean, one way of looking at it, like some people will dwell on, well, it's not specialized enough. It can't, reach out like a Mark 12 can with a higher magnification or with the extra barrel length. But I would actually venture to say, we'll think of all of the increased capability logistically spread across your team that you would have at that point. I think that is absolutely worth it when you're talking about that. I think specialized weapons are cool, but at the same time, when it comes to a practicality, if you could give, like, if you take one thing and split up all the specialties and spread it amongst your squad and be able to have more of that capability spread out into different parts of, let's say, where you're positioning your men in on a whatever operation you're doing, that gives the commander the flexibility in an operation to do much more than having all of your eggs tied up in one basket.
Next question is, how do you draw the line of distinction between sort of like a general purpose AR and the SPR? Would you say, and again, I think we've already sort of tipped our hand as to the answer to this, but would you say it's predominantly based off of barrel length, barrel profile, or something more along the lines of like optics choice and optics package?
I think that's essentially what this entire video is about right now. Like that blurred line between a general purpose rifle and an SPR, especially when you slap an LPVO on those things. Now, I mean, I would even put this and venture even farther and say this, like, a lot of us right now are thinking about probably ARs, right? When we're talking about general purpose rifle, SPR. What about a SCAR? SCAR 16. We've shot 800 meter targets on range with a SCAR. No issue. It's a 16-inch barrel. It has different characteristics. It folds, and I would say it fills the entire charge.
Yep.
What if you look at an AUG with a 1.7 twist barrel? Because typically right now the ones that are out there, you're using the Austrian blanks with 1.9. An AUG with 1.7 twist barrel, drop a 16 in there, and it's one of the cursed NATO mag AUGs, so you have magazine exchangeability with other stuff. It is a very reliable platform. You can mess with the trigger a little bit, and you could also suppress it. That would also fill a lot of those requirements that the SPR needs, right? You could even drop a 20-inch into the AUG, and it's still the full length of an M4 at that point. And so, I mean, I look at this, unfortunately I have two sides on this show. Like, one side, I have my like super like clone nerd side that I like geek out on things that someone, like 20 years ago wrote in some manual. for the military to adopt, and then what that particular thing had done during the global war on terror era and why this is so cool. But on the other side, I also look at things from a very practical perspective. Like the Mark 12, the way it is, it has a lot of things that are not optimized for the current employment. And so if I could get, for the price of one Mark 12, I could just use all of that to buy 4 sets of ATACR optics and drop them onto 4 of my operators in a team. And all 4 of them can have similar capabilities that reach out to 800. Now, lethality, that's a question, but at the same time, that's a question for both sides, because 16 versus 18 is not that huge of a velocity difference.
No.
So, lethality question aside, you're spreading that capability out with the increased technology that we're allowed. So, that's the second part of that question is,
right.
Like,
I see Jeff actually hopped in. So Jeff, if you're still in here, we referenced you earlier, so be sure to go back and check it out. But Jeff says,
oh, there he is.
Yeah, the current URGI outperforms the Mark 12 just outside of having the sub MOA barrel. And the URGI has better trigger, lighter, better LPVO. Yep. Henry, the muzzle device. Henry.
Well, so here's one thing that, I'll say it again. I've said it many a times, the development of military. So there's guys out there that get upset that civilians would run around with full kit and do all this type of stuff with their companies, right? Not naming names, the educated people in the audience will understand what I'm talking about. The truth to it is that a significant amount of the military's gear is developed still on the competition field, is developed with guys who have companies who are in the position of machining these things. And a vast majority of these people are civilians. That's how they are able to run these companies to manufacture these things. Now, some of them were former mil, but a large amount of them have been civilians their entire life. Now, it's up to the military to militarize things. Like the URGI is a militarized, in my opinion, a gamer gun. Mm-hmm. So there is a huge role for the civilian shooter for the development of military gear. And so this is something like, if you look at the ordnance perspective, what was the last big project that the Ordnance Corps developed for the shooting world? The infamous M14. Oh. That was a government project developed by people in uniform, made by U.S. government-controlled arsenals. So if you contrast that to the AR-15, which was developed by, surprise, a civilian in a civilian company, and you contrast that to even like HK-416, plenty of civilians working that project, all of the handguns out there, and plenty of civilians. Even let's even drop to more modern things that we're talking about. The adaptation of LPVOs in the competition world. Competitors were crazy about LPVOs because they saw a capability. It was the glass that bridged your short range optic with long range, mid range capability. And let's look back at that picture of Jeff running the VCOG, right? Mm-hmm. That's how stuff ends up in the military.
Right. Well, I need to put that back up because that's actually like the perfect example. Only, especially because we're talking about this point a little bit more, and I appreciate that we are sort of like.
All right. So someone did point this out. The Picatinny rail, yes, the Picatinny rail was developed by the military. So good on that. The rail system and the concept of modularity was very good. But still, that is like a tiny speck in the many things out there. Because what I would say on the flip side of this, after the PIC rail, the M-LOK and KeyMod systems were both designed by civilian organizations. So, anyways,
yeah. So just from a purpose of the competition shooter, right? Like I can look at this and go, yeah, okay. Like everything from the LPVO to the 45-degree RMR or doctor sight, potentially in this case, not sure which it would have been, to the extended handguard, right? Like out to the end of the barrel, to the stinking Arredondo Magwell, like, which is like straight out of competition. Like Arredondo is like a competition manufacturer, right? And this isn't like it was remade for the military. Like this was just their Magwell from competition, right? So again, very interesting. And then obviously it's like it's tweaked with the things that are needed to tweak it for the application in which it's being utilized, right? Suppressor instead of muzzle brake, collapsible stock for use with the armor as opposed to a longer fixed stock or a precision shooting stock, which is more common in 3-gun, or at least it was in the era, right? In the 2010, 2013 era. So again, very interesting when you look at
this. Look at this comment. Jeff just commented. Again, anyone here, check out Modern Tactical Shooting. Jeff's a good friend of the channel, but this extends well past that. Jeff is actually a huge wealth of knowledge for the community. So look at this. He's told me the same thing. There's like there's no real difference between that rifle and the competition rifle that he used. And that's something that I've like brought up. So I bring that up to Josh so many times that like there are guys in the military, especially in the SOCOM world, that would run competition. Like, depending on the era, there were, like some people didn't like that. Some people thought it was, some people would then look at competition and say, you're going to get killed in the streets for running around, this thing. But, that's also, you do the same thing when you're working, room clearing drills, you with footwork and how you're going to approach targets and stuff like that. Right. But guys would, especially in SOCOM, guys would look at what the newest development in civilian companies are and try to militarize them and try to use them on deployment. And then that turns into, an active search of a solution that the SOCOM guys were looking for. And this extends well past the weapon systems, though. Like I'm also looking at like survival equipment, GPS, navigation systems, dive systems. That's a huge thing that military use to militarize vehicles, recovery systems, just like a huge array of things that the military encompasses. A lot of these things have roots from the civilian system. So I don't know, like guys out there who say that civilians should just go and join. I mean, I think they're missing the point on the role that civilians have in this world.
I would agree. As a final sort of like explanation point on the point on like competition stuff, even in the competition world, back in the 2010 era, it used to be rifle length guns, like 18-inch guns were what we were shooting back then, like at top level matches. Like pretty much everybody was on like an 18-inch rifle length gas gun, who was like at the very top of the competitive spectrum. But you look at where that's gone now, and that's not the case anymore. Like there are plenty of people who are running shorter guns. And the idea was you can get away with the 18-inch gun on close range stuff because it's still like relatively fine. It was smoother gassing with the rifle length gas on an 18, and then it gave you the advantage at long range. But when you look at, again, where things are at now, especially with the advent of like intermediate length gas systems and such, it's like everything is getting shorter, which again goes back to the same commentary we're talking about around being able to take 14.5s and press them out to 800 plus.
I mean,
yeah, actually, Jeff, I remember that specifically. I was at the match where Daniel did that and switched over to like the shorter gun for the first time. And everybody was like, holy crap. Because he went out and smoked everybody as usual with a 16. I think it was a 16-inch gun. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean
Or
that's, oh my
14.5, yeah.
gosh, it's like it's turned into like such a corny thing to say, like, training matters, like go out, train with your rifle, in a more civilianized term that would be just go out and shoot your stuff, enjoy it, figure it out, stuff that we did in college. Just unfortunately everything's more expensive nowadays to do that, but I think that's, building that on hand understanding of stuff and having that knowledge uh, pulls you away from these echo chambers that you see, online in certain circles that would tell you cannot do these certain things. And it, on some aspects, you learn why you cannot do these certain things. And so that experience, that training, that practice, that repetition, um, that is the key thing. That is the major thing that's driving us in re-looking at SPRs and this conversation on whether it's just the Mark 12 being an SPR, or the SPR can actually be, let's say, like a Daniel Defense RIS 3. Oh my, are you okay?
I'm still here. I lost. We're still here. Proceed.
So specifically, I'm bringing up the Daniel upper, the RIS 3 upper, because okay.
Proceed.
So specifically, I'm bringing up the Daniel RIS 3 upper because that is technically a civilian upper that is very similar to the URGI, right? And so, can that fill the niche? I mean, probably. I don't know. I haven't. I would like to shoot one, but that's where we're getting this. Is that the knowledge that we've developed in the last, I don't know, like decade and a half. And the interesting thing is, like how the knowledge interweaves on the internet, through venues on YouTube and Discords, Reddit, has been driving people to relook at some of these sacred cows in cloner communities.
So with that said, like I think that's probably a good place to wrap this, Henry. And what I want to do is sort of put a nice little bow on this, which comes down to getting caught up in the idea of what to call your rifle, a GPR versus an SPR versus I've got to have a rifle with this particular piece of gear or that particular piece of gear because that's what's cool or trendy today, is effectively like all BS. You can't replace the experience that you will get by literally going and getting reps shooting, and doing the actual act with gear. Like you'll find out very quickly doing certain things what does work and what doesn't work, and what you need to or don't need to supplement with equipment in order to be more effective. Like you'll learn very quickly if you are out there shooting and you can't see the targets with your 6-power top end LPVO at 800 in the woods or in brush, like that's going to tell you something, right? But you're not actually going to know whether or not you can or can't until you try it. So point being, get out there, and as Henry said, as cliche as it is, like get reps. Like that's the piece that matters. Chasing the idea of I have a 16-inch gun, but what I really need is an 18-inch gun in order to be able to do this. Like what I have is a 2.5 to 10, but what I really need is a 4 to 14 in order to be able to do this. Like, no, I just don't believe any of that at this point. Like at this point, with what we've done and all of the different platforms we've shot over time, it really just comes back to like literally just go shoot. Just go get reps, go get positive instruction if you need it from somebody who is an expert in the field of being able to do long range shooting, or this isn't even long range, but this is like long range for an AR platform, I suppose, want to call it that. Go and do those things and then practice it again and again and again and again. And there's certainly, again, this isn't to suggest that like that's me or even that that's Henry, right? Like there's things that I still learn listening to people who are very experienced. It might not be gross, massive things now, but there are small pieces. Like hey, if you thought about dialing an extra mil so that you can push out your max point blank range, like that's still stuff that I haven't really thought through. I haven't really like done a bunch of shooting with that style technique to see what happens when you do that and how it stacks up. There's still like little things as I'm reviewing different optics or different reticles that, oh, hey, like that's a really cool niche thing that I didn't understand what this was trying to do or what this reticle was trying to do or that was trying to do. And you can still gain some things and some knowledge doing it, but it all comes back to reps.
So on that note, there's been some guys out there who are asking if we could maybe put together a special poverty rifle and see.
Why did you say it? Why did you say it?
So I mean, I'd love to open the comment section for people to write to see what kind of poverty components we could maybe work into the special poverty rifle and how that matches with Josh's URGI.
Is this Dirt Squirrel round 2?
Oh, it's gonna be better than Dirt Squirrel. I'm genuinely interested though. It's interested in a really subversive way. Like I'm really curious at how cheap could you make an SPR that still does it? Like do I still have to, maybe I still have to substitute the barrel to get more velocity because it's like a cheaper barrel, right? But that then still gives me more velocity and it costs like half the price of a nice, Geisley upper. And maybe I could make a disgusting special poverty rifle that I could just shoot to hell and just love it.
Can you imagine if you did it and then we shot it at 1K?
I know that's my point. Like I mean, that's something that we could honestly look at, pursuing, because look at some of the things out there. I don't know. I would have to choose whether I would want to use PSA or Aero though, because Aero is not that much more expensive than PSA. But instinctively, it seems like Aero has just that little step that gives people a little bit more confidence. But is that step really a thing? I would say Primary Arms probably has the market cornered for the optic though on that.
I'm just trying to keep up with the chat right now, and I'm dying. I like the idea of a Krieger 20-inch barrel placed inside the Primary Arms upper.
Just peek all of the money into the barrel. That's a valid point.
Ultimate sleeper build.
That's a valid point, though. Like, what if you just buy a Primary Arms or a PSA upper, right? Throw everything away. Even just throw the rest of the stuff away and put all of the money towards like a top tier barrel.
Yeah, it's got what are the big ones? Krieger's big, Bartline's good.
Put a Bartline into a Primary Arms, a PSA upper with a Primary Arms optic on top. And just like watch people cry on the range.
All right. So you heard it here. Go ahead, hit the comment section. Let Henry know exactly what components he should put into his poverty SPR.
No, it's a special poverty rifle. It's still an SPR. Sorry. It's just a special poverty rifle.
What does it have to do? It has to hit at 1,000. We're saying it has to hit 1,000, and it has to do what? Survive like getting dropped? Are we going to drop test it to see if it survives?
We could drop test it if we want to.
Okay.
I mean, look, we could look at it from a special poverty receiver perspective, and then put even more money towards the barrel itself.
Yeah.
Just peek everything onto the barrel, and watch people's minds explode.
This is a good idea. There's nothing wrong with this. This is a good idea.
This is fine.
It's fine. All right. So with that said, hit the comment section up. If you're still here, if you're still enjoying the show, we Oh, the Dalwini. Delicious.
Someone's asking. I don't know why it's not like really showing well, but yeah, there you go.
If you're still here and enjoying the video, again, hit that like button. Make sure you're still subscribed because YouTube does some weird crap. And Henry, do you have any words to lead us out with?
Man, look, I had a lot of fun doing this. I know, like it's a relatively nerdy thing, but we're a relatively nerdy channel to begin with. I would say, you guys out there, just do you have any thoughts, any video ideas that we could pursue on this topic, like trends that the internet has set ablaze, that we could basically spend an hour and change nerding out on and talking about? I thought that should be a lot of fun,
Give Henry horrible ideas.
Well, what other things that have become trendy? That's a big thing. Like the ACOG RMR was trending for a while, and then Nashville happened, and everyone was relooking at LPVOs. I don't. Okay, like guys are telling me to just like deliberately use cheap stuff, but like I'm not necessarily like deliberately just doing cheap stuff. Like I actually want some type of substance into these conversations. It's just not just it's not just a stunt. It's not just a publicity stunt. I want to learn from these conversations, but there's a lot of trends out there because the gun world, much like the fashion world, is like has these trends and ebbs and flows. And if you guys have any thoughts on trends that we should look at, let us know.
Henry, before we sign off, apparently Redneck sent in a super chat. I did not see it come in at all, but throw that up real quick.
How far up was it?
It's in the starred category on.
Here we go. Okay.
I don't even. Have you ever heard of that round?
I have never heard of this round. So this goes back to America has always had this thing with Wildcat cartridges. I am not saying to not experiment with things if you are, with the caveat that you are knowledgeable enough to experiment with things. And otherwise, unless you don't care about your fingers, right? America's shooting culture in general has had a fascination with Wildcat cartridges, pushing things to the limit, seeing how well you could do with certain things. Now, one of the big advances from this is 300 Whisper / 300 Blackout. For a long time, was a Wildcat cartridge, well before suppressors were very prevalent and popular in the society, but especially was picked up by back then AAC, and then pushed into not general service, but special operations services through 300 Blackout, subguns, or what do you call those things? PDWs.
Yeah.
So on the other side of that came the 6.8 SPC, things that 6.8 and then the 6.8 caliber being the next thing, that had a lot of media hype, but never gained a lot of bite because again, it was fighting against the 5.56 general purpose. It was a highly efficient cartridge to begin with, that we had massive stockpiles on. I think it's interesting to continue to experiment and learn about certain things that are out there. However, when it comes to actual use, real world logistics should always be considered. Now, that applies to military, applies to law enforcement, applies to general civilian ownership of firearms. It's like if you had a car that, let's say, ran on plutonium juice that came out of Mount Haleakala in Hawaii. and it is 3,000 times more potent than gasoline. But you can't get it at your local gas station, and you need all sorts of hazmat delivery fees for it to come in. It's interesting, yes. It's interesting that the technology is being looked at and researched and developed. But if you actually want this to be your daily driver, you may want a gasoline-powered vehicle. You know, that's just how it comes down to it. There's a very practical element of logistics that has to be considered when we look at some of these Gucci rounds or whatever that's out there. Are there any more of these comments that we need to look at?
I didn't see any other supers. No.
We'll give it a quick glance if there's any good comments we could pull up if you want to. Otherwise, we are reaching an hour and 41. We're a bit over our time as well.
Yeah. Well, probably a perfect opportunity to just make a quick note that this episode is sponsored by Midway USA. So thank you to Midway. And obviously also Slate Black Industries, which you guys who follow the show know. So again, as usual, if you're not part of the newsletter gang, you should probably correct that. You can go to Slate Black Industries and sign up for the newsletter gang there. And yeah, I mean, Henry, any last words?
I love it. I'm seeing a lot of suggestions on barrel choice and, build choice for the special poverty rifle. It's going to be great. Josh is going to love it.
All right. Good stuff. Henry, take us out. Guys, until next time, we'll see you on the range.
All right. Let's... And we are closing right.
716, this is Jill Knight 6, 4 Vic, 8 packs, Redcon 1, green to green. How copy, over?
Jill Knight 6, this is 716, roger, over. 16, Jill Knight 1.